world we live in, a world where disease shapes history in profound ways, but also a world where history shapes disease. Like, anyone can get tuberculosis, but not everyone has an equal chance of getting it, and certainly not everyone has an equal chance of dying from it. To understand why, I had to go back, way back, to discover how our earliest understandings of TB evolved alongside culture into the problem we're now facing. First, let me give you a very basic overview of our current understanding of the disease, which can be summarized as tuberculosis is weird. It's an infectious disease, meaning it's caused by germs, like COVID-19. It's spread through the air we breathe. And you might be surprised to learn that around a quarter of all humans are currently infected with Mycobacterium tuberculosis. But only about 5 to 10% of them will ever progress to what is called active disease, which is when the infection makes you chronically sick. If an infection does proceed to active disease, it usually happens within 2 years of the initial infection, but TB also may lie dormant for decades before suddenly exploding. What causes this progression to active disease? Well, again, it's complicated. We don't fully know, but risk factors include malnutrition, lack of access to medical care, crowded housing conditions, and a severely compromised immune system, especially from insufficiently treated HIV infection. But even once the disease becomes active, its course is extremely unpredictable. It may kill its victims within a few weeks or over many years. It usually attacks the lungs, but can also invade other organs like the brain or pancreas or spinal column. For reasons we don't fully understand, some patients will recover without treatment, but most, if left untreated, will eventually die of tuberculosis. Much of the strangeness here is related to the bacterium itself. Mycobacterium tuberculosis has an unusually fatty, thick cell wall, which makes it difficult for infection-fighting cells to destroy the bacteria. So instead, the bacteria is surrounded, first by one white blood cell and then by many, which creates this ball of calcifying tissue called a tubercle. As long as these vaguely spherical tubercles hold the bacteria within them, active disease never develops. But if the bacteria escapes and the immune system isn't strong enough to surround all the new bacteria with tubercles, the body can slowly be overwhelmed by infection, eventually leading to death. Now, because it takes so long to build the complicated fortress of its cell wall, Mycobacterium tuberculosis has an incredibly slow growth rate compared to other bacteria. Like in laboratory environments, E. coli divides and doubles about once every 20 minutes. Mycobacterium tuberculosis divides about once per day. And so infections simply take longer to make a person sick. In short, TB is not like a plague that sweeps through a community where one member of a household gets sick and everyone else in the household is sick 3 days later. It's not like a cancer or heart disease that affects one person in a home but rarely spreads to others. And it's not like an E. coli infection where you get violently sick all at once. And being so fundamentally different from other infections is precisely why the classical understandings of tuberculosis varied so widely, and why even today, the stories we tell ourselves about the disease reveal at least as much about humans as they do about tuberculosis. So it wouldn't be accurate to say that we thought of tuberculosis one way or another in antiquity. We thought of it many different ways. Some communities believed the disease was genetic, others thought it was contagious, some thought it was caused by foul air, others by a disharmony of fluids within the body. Some even approached a germ theory of disease, like hundreds of years before humans invented the microscope. The great Persian scholar and poet Ibn Sina wrote that diseases such as TB were caused by tainted foreign organisms that are not visible by naked eye, which, very impressive, but no way to confirm it pre-microscopy. I want to pause here to note a defining feature of humans, which is that we like to know why things happen, especially why really bad things happen. And if a reason is not immediately apparent, we will find one. I'm reminded of a short poem by Kurt Vonnegut. Tiger gotta hunt, bird gotta fly, man gotta sit and wonder why. Tiger got to sleep, bird got to land, man gotta tell himself he understand. And this brings us to an important facet of understanding human responses to illness: stigma. As part of our desire to answer the question why by telling ourselves we understand, humans commonly construct moral and ethical narratives around illness. Like, my dad had cancer twice when I was a kid, and I saw some of this firsthand. People kept their distance from us. Some said he got cancer because his parents smoked, or because he didn't exercise enough, or because he didn't eat broccoli, or whatever. And it's true that secondhand smoke and poor diet are risk factors for cancer, but it's also true that the vast majority of people whose parents smoked do not get cancer when they are a 32-year-old father of 2 young kids. We do not want to reckon with a world that is merely unfair, where some people get sick not because they did something wrong, but because the world is unjust, and insofar as it is just, it's random. And so we tell ourselves we understand, which too often means creating explanations that blame the sufferer. Stigma is a way of saying, you deserved this to happen, but implied within the stigma is also, and I don't deserve it, and so I don't need to worry about it happening to me. Stigma can become a kind of double burden for the sick. In addition to living with the physical and psychological challenges of illness, there's the additional challenge of having their humanity discounted. Think of the word universally used in English to describe tuberculosis patients in the 18th and 19th centuries. They were called invalids. They were literally invalid. People living with TB today have told me that fighting the disease was hard, but fighting the stigma of their communities was even harder. Now, stigma is very complex, of course, but researchers have identified certain hallmarks of highly stigmatized illnesses. Chronic illnesses are more likely to be stigmatized than acute ones, for instance, as are illnesses with high levels of perceived peril. And critically for understanding tuberculosis, stigma can be compounded if a disease is understood to be infectious. Finally, the origin or perceived origin of a disease also matters. If an illness is seen to be the result of choice, it is much more likely to be stigmatized. So for instance, people with major depression are often told to just choose to be happier, just as those with substance abuse disorders are told to just choose to quit drinking. And some cancers and heart diseases are stigmatized for resulting from purported choice as well. Of course, this is not how biology works. Illness has no moral compass. It does not punish the evil and reward the good. It doesn't know about evil and good. But we want life to be a story that makes sense, which is why, for example, it was commonly believed up until the middle of the 20th century that cancer was caused by things like social isolation. Parents were actually told their kids got leukemia because they hadn't been adequately loved as infants. If a clear cause and effect isn't present, we will invent one, even if it's cruel, because tigers gotta sleep, and birds gotta land, and man gotta tell himself he understand. TB occupies an interesting place in this conversation. It's a chronic disease with high levels of perceived peril, but it wasn't always understood to be infectious, and in much of the world, it wasn't seen as a choice. And yet, TB was a highly stigmatized disease. It was often associated with demon possession or excessive alcohol consumption or moral frailty. But in Northern Europe, beginning in the mid-18th century, it became untenable to understand the disease then known as consumption through only a stigmatic lens. The disease had exploded, especially in Britain's cities and North American colonies. Stigmatizing away an illness becomes harder when everyone seems to be getting it, not just the poor or the vulnerable, But even the rich, I mean, the richest individual of the 19th century died of TB at the age of 56. It killed presidents and kings and poets and actresses. And so suddenly consumption became a romanticized disease, a disease of beauty and refinement and intellectual sophistication. Death and decay are often beautiful, Henry David Thoreau wrote, like the pearly tear of the shellfish or the hectic glow of consumption. So it may be tempting to think that romanticizing a disease would be better than stigmatizing it, but as somebody who suffers from mental illness, I understand firsthand that the two aren't entirely separable. Like, both strategies ultimately other the sufferer, imagining them as somehow removed from the social order. Mental illness is often romanticized as unwellness that brings on creative genius or other superpowers. But of course, mental illness is also heavily stigmatized in our culture. And so romanticization and stigmatization are essentially like complementary strategies for casting people out of society and finding a story that makes sense for why those people ended up sick. In the case of consumption, this romanticization goes deep and wide. Like, once you start noticing the impacts of this story on contemporary culture, you start to wonder if there's anything in our lives today that's not connected to TB. So classically, consumption was viewed as a disease of the air. It was an illness of the breath, of the place where the body interacts with the atmosphere. Consider many of our words for the human soul: the Hebrew ruach, the Chinese qi, the English spirit, and the Inuit sila, all derive from words meaning breath or breathing. Breath is life. To be inspired is literally to breathe in. To be expired is literally to breathe all the way out. And so it was easy to make this disease of breath into a disease of the spirit, the qi, the sila, and the ruach. So much so that at times, consumptives were seen as paragons of brilliance and beauty. In men, consumption was believed to bring creative powers to new levels. Scholars pointed to the fact that everyone from Stephen Crane to Frédéric Chopin to the sculptor of the Statue of Liberty died of consumption. Less attention was paid to the fact that in a world where roughly 30% of all Northern Europeans were dying of a disease, it shouldn't be particularly surprising that many Northern European artists and writers were dying of it. But like one magazine at the time linked TB to authors in particular, writing that an author's waywardness, peevishness, irascibility, misanthropy, and murky passions are referable to their constitutional peculiarities and condition. In simple words, that their mental eccentricities result from the derangement of bodily health. And that's precisely what I mean when I say that romanticization is not a kind or generous way of treating the ill. I am an author, and I, for one, am deeply offended by the notion that my waywardness, peevishness, irascibility, misanthropy, and murky passions 19th century mag. It's hard to overstate how profound the link between consumption and male creative genius was believed to be. It is said that Victor Hugo's friends, for instance, joked with him that he could have been a truly great novelist if only he'd contracted consumption. Lord Byron wrote, "I should like, I think, to die of consumption, because then the women would all say, 'See that poor Byron, how interesting he looks in dying.'" And if men in Northern Europe were believed to achieve via consumption greater artistic and creative heights, then women were believed to become more beautiful and ethereal and wondrously pure.
Or resistance to it. And so they did suffer, but then they recovered and their population expanded and in fact exploded across Western Europe. So it is very likely that what happened is that when they arrived in Western Europe, Western Europe was either already ravaged by plague, and their population was severely weakened by this, and it was very easy to overtake them because of the population decline and their sickness. Or it was in fact brought by the Indo-Europeans themselves, and through contact with the existing population, they spread the disease to them. This is very possible as well. And in fact, we see a similar thing happen when Europeans first arrived in the Americas. Now, of course, the folk legend is that when the Europeans arrived in the Americas, that, the explorers just wiped out all the native population. But what really happened is that they unknowingly, remember this is long before germ theory, they unknowingly spread plague to all the peoples that they encountered, and were introduced to people who had never contacted this disease before, and it spread through their populations, wiping out whole communities. But after that, it was carried by other native population groups to their own communities throughout the entirety of the Americas. And so millions of people likely were killed by this plague. We don't really know how.
This purge of the Jews came from a Christian clerk who wanted to stop traditional Jews from influencing conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity. Oddly enough, the clerk himself had converso ancestors.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition!
But we guess that didn't stop him. A number of these exiled Spanish Jews decided to seek revenge from their anti-Semitic monarchs on the high seas. These long-bearded, sword-wielding, Spanish-speaking members of the tribe were like something out of an overblown Tarantino vengeance fantasy. There was even a pirate nicknamed the Great Jew, something out of an overblown Tarantino vengeance fantasy. There was even a pirate nicknamed the Great Jew. His actual name was Sinan Reyes, and he was second in command to the pirate Barbarossa, Italian for Redbeard, in the early 1500s. The duo attacked their fair share of Spanish merchant ships, but it wasn't all fun and games and bottles of kosher rum. In the early 1540s, the Great Jew's son was kidnapped at sea by King Charles V of Spain, and Redbeard recaptured the kidnapped boy in an epic series of attacks that included sacking a small Spanish town and blowing up a fort. Another Jewish pirate was Moses Cohen Henriquez, considered to be one of the most successful buccaneers ever. He was supposedly the brains behind one of the biggest pirate hauls in history, the 1628 capture of the Spanish Silver Fleet, a convoy of about 25 ships loaded with treasure of the Spanish Silver Fleet, a convoy of about 25 ships loaded with treasure returning from Spain's American colony. A convoy of about 25 ships loaded with treasure returning from Spain's American colonies. Henriquez sailed with the Dutch West India Company of the Spanish Silver Fleet, a convoy of about 25 ships loaded with treasure returning from Spain's American colonies. Henriquez sailed with the Dutch West India Company returning from Spain's American colonies. Henriquez sailed with the Dutch West India Company admiral and low-key pirate Pete Hayne, whose anti-Spanish agenda was inspired by his time as a slave on a Spanish ship. Whose anti-Spanish agenda was inspired by his time as a slave on a Spanish ship. The silver and gold the duo lifted in the raid is estimated to be worth over $1 billion today. Not bad for a day's haul. Henriquez was a pretty wild guy too. He established his own pirate island, where he schlepped and hid his fortune, continued to advise Hayne, and sailed the seven seas. Pirate island, haul. Henriquez was a pretty wild guy too. He established his own pirate island, where he schlepped and hid his fortune, continued to advise Hayne, and sailed the seven seas, eluding capture for the rest of his days. Other Jewish pirates were less tethered to the bad boy life. Yaakov Curiel, aka Diego Perez de Costa, was a converso Jew who commanded 3 pirate ships in the Caribbean seas and spent a good decade or so pillaging unsuspecting Spanish vessels. And then, he found God. He repented for his marauding ways, became 3 pirate ships in the Caribbean seas, and spent a good decade or so pillaging unsuspecting Spanish vessels. And then, he found God. He repented for his marauding ways, became the first ever Baal Teshuvah pirate. Eventually, he made his way to the land of Israel, where he settled in Safed, a city. He found God. He repented for his marauding ways, became the first ever Baal Teshuvah pirate. Eventually, he made his way to the land of Israel, where he settled in Safed, a city in the Galilee, after becoming enthralled with the mystical teachings of Rabbi Isaac Luria, or the Arizal, the father of contemporary Kabbalah. Then there was the man known as the Pirate Rabbi, who terrorized the seafaring Spanish in the late 1500s, using part of his loot to found a community of Sephardic Jews in Amsterdam, Israel, where he settled in Safed, a city in the Galilee, after becoming enthralled with the mystical teachings of Rabbi Isaac Luria, or the Arizal, the father of contemporary Kabbalah. Then there was the man known as the Pirate Rabbi, who terrorized the seafaring Spanish in the late 1500s, using part of his loot to found a community of Sephardic Jews in Amsterdam. The pirate rabbi supposedly kept kosher on the high seas, and may have even brought a chef along with him to make sure he wasn't eating treif. Jewish pirates tended to form partnerships with leading non-Jewish pirates of the day. This often led to remarkable crossovers of Jewish and pirate culture, including treasure maps written in Hebrew, ships with names like the Queen Esther and the Shield of Abraham, and tombstones in Jamaican Jewish cemeteries that bore the skull and crossbones. These sea-bound raiders fought for decades against the Spanish, that bore the skull and crossbones and the Shield of Abraham, and tombstones in Jamaican Jewish cemeteries, ships with names like the Queen Esther and the Shield of Abraham, and tombstones in Jamaican.
Honor and pleasure to be here with Professor Stan Mervis.
How many? But surely their population significantly declined, and so this made it very easy for the new coming populations from Europe to settle into what was effectively vacant land. You know, it wasn't that in every case there was, of course, conflict, but it was the case that it was very easy to just come into the land because there was no one actually there because they had died from the plague. And a similar scenario, no one actually there because they had died from the plague. And a similar scenario seems to have happened, or may have happened, with the initial Indo-European expansion into Europe. So it was not only that they were extremely militaristic, but it was also because there was this plague that they were in fact benefiting from. Although they had suffered from it themselves, they were also benefiting from it because it was wiping out, to a large degree, the population groups in the areas that they would come to inhabit.
As Charlotte Bronte put it 2 years after the publication of her novel Jane Eyre, consumption, I am aware, is a flattering malady. That flattering malady, incidentally, would kill Charlotte, and also all 3 of her sisters. Patients with active TB typically become pale and thin, with rosy cheeks and wide TB typically, and also all 3 of her sisters. Patients with active TB typically become pale and thin, with rosy cheeks and wide sunken eyes due to the low blood oxygenation and fevers that accompany the disease. Like the English actor Eliza Poe, whose beauty was widely admired, looked stereotypically tubercular. Her rosy cheeks, alabaster skin, wide eyes, and tiny body were all the result of consumption, which killed her in 1811, when she was 23 or 24, and her son Edgar was 2. Edgar Allan Poe would go on to describe many of the women in his stories and poems as similarly wispy, pale, and large-eyed. By the time of Eliza's death, so-called consumptive chic had taken over European beauty standards. American and European magazines encouraged women to apply the poison belladonna to their eyelids to dilate their pupils so they could have that wide-eyed consumptive look, and offered instructions for how to apply red paint to the lips and cheeks to capture the hectic glow of consumptive fevers. I probably do not need to point out that from runway shows to fashion magazines, these standards of beauty are still molding what is considered to be feminine beauty. But TB shaped not only the makeup and beauty standards of the era, but also fashion, which for women sought to emphasize the visible symptoms of illness. The most glaring such clothing was the pointed corset, which emphasized the narrowness of women's waists. The similarity, by the way, between waist and waist is an etymological coincidence in English, but a telling one. These corsets were so restrictive that women were limited in the kinds of physical activities they could accomplish and struggled to get full breaths of air, both of which mirrored the experience of actual consumption. And so consumption had become fully glamorous and idealized. There is a dread disease, Charles Dickens wrote in Nicholas Nickleby, in which the struggle between soul and body is so gradual, quiet, and solemn that the spirit grows light and sanguine with its lightening load. Dickens did not name the disease, nor did his readers need him to. Everyone knew of the disease that shrank the body and enlarged the soul. But of course, this all belies the true violence of consumption. Perhaps the most famous 19th century victim of tuberculosis was the English poet John Keats. When Keats's body was autopsied a couple days after his death at the age of 25, the doctor wrote, "The lungs were completely gone." This was and is the truth of death by tuberculosis. The afflicted often drown as blood and pus fills their lungs. They die starved of oxygen, in agony. Here's where the romanticization of tuberculosis becomes, believe it or not, even more insidious, because underlying all these shifts was a feeling that consumption was, as some 18th century observers put it, a disease of civilization. People at the time knew that city dwellers were far more likely to develop consumption than those in rural communities, and this concept of consumption as a civilized disease also meant that it could not be a disease of uncivilized people, which led to a racialization of the illness. In Europe and the US, most white doctors believed that TB could only infect white people, and it was sometimes known as the white man's plague. One American doctor, for instance, called it a disease of the master race, not of the slave race. As Frank Snowden writes, in the United States, the prevailing wisdom was that African Americans contracted a different disease. This phenomenon also extended to other colonial empires. Many European colonialists believed that TB was either rare or non-existent among people of color. In reality, there was extensive illness and death from consumption in colonial South Asia and Africa, and many local healthcare providers people of color. In reality, there was extensive illness and death from consumption in colonial South Asia. There was extensive illness and death from consumption in colonial South Asia and Africa, and many local healthcare providers sought to bring attention to the crisis. But it went undetected and uncounted by colonial authorities because the entire premise of colonialism relied on white supremacy, and the genetic understanding of consumption relied upon the idea that only supreme people could contract it. Acknowledging that consumption was common among enslaved, colonized, and marginalized people would have undermined not just the theory of consumption, but the project of colonialism itself. Toward the end of the 19th century, the romanticization of consumption began to decline as it became increasingly obvious that the illness was not exclusively or even primarily a disease of the rich and brilliant. Scholars had begun to turn their eyes away from the languorous, fainting young women and their romantic lovers, write René and Jean Dubois. They noticed instead the miserable humanity living in the dreary tenements born of the Industrial Revolution. In the tentacular cities, they saw hosts of men, women, and children, pale too, often cold and starving, working long hours in dark and crowded shops, breathing smoke and coal dust. Tuberculosis was there, breeding suffering and misery without romance. Still, arguments raged over what caused the disease until 1882, when a vexatious little organism called M. tuberculosis was first identified by the physician Robert Koch. Over the next few years, the replication and acceptance of Koch's research meant that the era of consumption as an inherited condition that grew the soul by shrinking the body slowly faded away. No longer could consumption be understood as an inherited condition shaped by sad passion and wondrously translucent skin. Now it was a germ disease, an illness of filth and overcrowding and poverty. The era of tuberculosis had begun.
From your local tuberculosis association.
Today, we understand the explosion of TB in the 19th century to have been primarily a result of the Industrial Revolution, which led to cramped living conditions in cities where workers could easily spread TB to one another, and where widespread malnutrition, an important risk factor for developing active disease, made people especially vulnerable. And so just as Britain was ground zero for the Industrial Revolution, it was ground zero for the rise of tuberculosis. And we've seen TB grow with industrialization in other communities as well, from India to Nigeria. TB's parallel journey with capital, as Vidya Krishnan puts it, has been seen in outbreak after outbreak. But at the time, industrialization wasn't seen as the culprit. Instead, as understandings of TB shifted to being about poverty rather than romance, racialized stigma did a 180. Whereas before, Black and brown people were seen as incapable of getting such a beautiful disease, now they were blamed for stigma did a 180. Whereas before, Black and brown people were seen as incapable of getting such a beautiful disease, now they were blamed for it. The Negro race suffers from tuberculosis tainting the country, one American official wrote. Racialized medicine no longer maintained that high rates of consumption among white people was a sign of white superiority. Instead, racialized medicine now maintained that high rates of consumption among Black people was a sign of white superiority. But of course, none of that was true. Black people were not more susceptible to TB because of factors inherent to race. They were more susceptible to tuberculosis because of racism.
So that's how prominent the Hittites were by this time. Egypt is still probably the biggest empire of the day, but the Hittites would be that imposing that they would be a great attractive possibility there for this young princess. As it turns out, the prince, the son of Suppiluliuma, was killed. He was assassinated at the border of Egypt as he was going to marry Akhenaten, and the killer, presumably, was the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, a guy named Horemheb. So, the intrigue continues unabated, but we'll leave that little story behind. The next character is Merchili II. He rules from 1320 to 1295. He expands Hittite control throughout the region so that by the time of its largest expanse, the Hittite Empire would look something like this, dominating most of Turkey and indeed reaching to some degree over almost to the coast. And indeed, some people have thought the Hittites actually did dominate in the region of Asia Minor off to the left on this map as well. He knows that a showdown is brewing with the Egyptians. And he begins to prepare for what will ultimately be the conflict fought at the Battle of Kadesh. However, he dies before he can see that through. It brings his son, Mu'attali, to the throne 1295. He rules till 1274, but he is very much concerned with problems off to the west in Asia Minor. This is probably because, if you know anything of ancient history, you know the Trojan War was fought. Anybody know in round numbers about when the Trojan War was fought? Anybody know? Probably anywhere from 1250 down to about 1200 BC. Best guess is sometime in that range, and it may very well be that the Hittites, who were closely connected to the Trojans, were preoccupied with the threats that were mounting there. So the Trojan Wars between the Mycenaeans, Agamemnon, you know all of that, the Helen, you know, Paris, Hector, all of that, remember that? And of course the Trojans, and that is brewing. That seems to be, you know, kind of developing at this point, and it may very well be that that's why Mu'attali is preoccupied there. But he's also worried about Egypt, and so he assigns to his brother Hattushili the responsibility of getting ready for a war with Egypt. And so Hattushili does that, and he does all kinds of construction there in the city of Hattusha to sort of intimidate the Egyptians, sort of like slap talk of the ancient world, you know, we'll defeat you, this kind of thing. And so this is what's going on between them. And finally, this conflict erupts, and it's called the Battle of Kadesh. We've talked about that. It takes place in 1276. So right in the very middle of the era of the judges, you have this huge, the biggest military showdown in history takes place. You don't hear a word about it in the Bible, you know. I have a comment about that a little bit later, but we'll just note that for right now. It takes place at of the era of the judges, you have this huge, the biggest military showdown in history takes place. You don't hear a word about it in the Bible, you know. I have a comment about that a little bit later, but we'll just note that for right now.
Okay, now.
But most of them simply adopted the Bible. The black Jews that exist in Ethiopia, the Sudan, southern Egypt, from, 1400 BC. But most of them simply adopted the Bible as slaves and really grabbed onto it.
Okay, now.
And they're not any more related to Abraham than well, I am related to Abraham, than, say, Menachem Begin. He's not related to Abraham at all.
Okay, now, we're in the historical arena here. And what I'm looking for is an understanding and a connection. We're talking about the origination of people, the origin of people.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to understand, okay, in one of your books you talked about Neanderthals and that Neanderthal aggression, and I do believe you made the connection between the Neanderthal and the Ashkenazi Jew, or did you make that connection?
Yes, because the Neanderthals came from this, they originally were all over Europe, but as the climate changed to be milder, they retreated to the mountains, which still held the climate to which they were adapted, a glacial one. Okay, those are the Caucasus Mountains mainly, but also some in Italy, the Pyrenees and whatnot. And wherever those mountains are, you find highly Neanderthal people. But the biggest concentration of them by far is the Caucasus Mountains. And that's where the Ashkenazi Jews come from, the South Russian steppes at the foot of the Caucasus Mountains.
Did any other people descend from, any other white folks descend from these?
Plenty of them, and they're all aggressive. Like the problems that Okay, if you get a map of the Caucasus, by next week it's going to be out of date because there's going to be 3 other independent republics. These people are highly aggressive. Each little valley is its own country. So a lot of people descend from this kind of people. However, the Jews are a kind of a special case in that their religion held them together, and there was many more of them converted because by then they had been pushed out of the Caucasus by population pressure onto the steppes of South Russia. And so there was a lot of them, and they became Jewish, and so their religion held them together. But there are other people like Georgians, Chechens, they all come from the same stock.
What is this religion that you're talking about?
Judaism.
And how did it hold them together that you're talking about?
Judaism stock.
What is this?
People like Georgians, Chechens, they all come from the same stock.
What is this religion that you're talking about?
Judaism.
And how did it hold them together? What is the practices of?
Well, I don't want to go into the practices of Judaism, okay? There's a certain set of tenets, a certain set of laws. If you abide by them, you're Jewish. If you don't, you're not. And so that's a religion. It's a cohesive religion. And they adopted it, these Khazars, from the South Russian steppes, who had formerly been Huns. They're the same people. They adopted this Judaism, and they're called Jews today.
So these Khazars, did they have a religion, or what held them together before they became Jews?
Well, first of all, they were tribal, okay? Their tribes held them together. They had a close-knit tribal group, but they didn't have any cohesive, you might say, widespread religion. It is thought, because nobody knows, that they were sort of shamanistic pagans, very much like the Huns under Attila, who invaded into Europe around AD 450. Those were the same people. And they worshiped different clan gods, tribal gods, and all this. Nobody knows very much about it. They were shamanistic, very much like the peoples of Siberia, say. But when they adopted Judaism under pressure of being converted to either Christianity or Islam, then they adopted that creed cohesively. And as a matter of fact, they adopted the Hebrew language. Like you can find coins from the Khazar capital, which was on the Volga River, which are struck in Hebrew. But the language is Gothic, their own step Gothic, but rendered in the Hebrew script.
So when we talk about Jews and the origin of Jews, okay, let's just look at your chosen people from the Caucasus. We talk about the historical role in the slave trade.
Yeah.
Which Jews, we're talking about the Ashkenazi Jews and their role, or did the Sephardic Jews have a role too?
Both had a role. Between AD 740 and AD 1215, on the steppes, the Ashkenazi Jews totally enslaved the Slavs around them. Our word slavery, which you just used, comes from the word for a Slavic captive. And they conquered them in such huge numbers that the unfortunate people gave their name to their origin, i.e. slaves, Slavics. So that's what the Ashkenazim did between, say, 740 AD and 1200 AD. A little bit later, the Sephardic Jews, which by now had settled in Spain, they sailed across the ocean blue in 1492, as we know with Columbus, and then they started the transatlantic slave trade in black Africans.
In Jewish cemeteries that bore the skull and crossbones. These sea-bound raiders fought for decades against the Spanish, attacking ships and sharing Spanish naval secrets with Spain's enemies, all while building up a mercantile network connecting trading posts around the globe. Some scholars shy away from using the term Jewish pirates, trading posts around the globe. Some scholars shy away from using the term Jewish pirates, since a lot of the aforementioned people served in advisory roles to other leading pirates. But if we broaden the term to include buccaneers, smugglers, privateers, or, in Spanish, contrabandistas, there's a broad consensus that Jews at the time were involved in illegal trade and raid against the Spanish Empire. Maybe what we actually call them is not as important as just recognizing that they existed at all, and recognizing that the Jewish role in early mid-second millennia Caribbean maritime history was greater than we thought. These Jewish naval greats had profound influence on leading pirates at the time, and took their fate into their own hands by shooting back at the empire that tried to stomp them out. And many succeeded, which makes for some pretty thrilling stories of vengeance and self-determination, and highlights these pirates as colorful examples of Jews who stood up against their oppressors.
Before New World discovery, Spain and Portugal had gone to the Pope over a dispute about lines of demarcation, and the Pope had said to both Spain and Portugal, "You are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people." In other words, if a person is not a Christian, you are authorized to enslave the person. But in the politics of the papetry, the Portuguese always got the best of the deal. They were better Catholic politicians. And the Pope eventually, when the discovery was that Spain was grabbing more of the world than Portugal, there was a treaty of Tordesillas. Pope had said, "You take the East and you take the West, and you two good Catholic nations stop fighting among yourselves." And this was really as a result of Christopher Columbus grabbing. Christopher Columbus wasn't supposed to come to the New World. That was a violation of an agreement. But the Treaty of Tordesillas gave Portugal a big country called Brazil. Portugal, being so small, didn't have the money and the manpower to manage a country. And Portugal got lost in Brazil and dissipated so much energy in Brazil that colonial-wise, it couldn't move much further. Because, see, Portugal was already in West Africa. And the British, when the British came in, the British drove them out of West Africa. This is how the Portuguese got to the Congo. The Portuguese were in the Congo for 100 years.
That was an amazing introduction, Jim. Thank you so much, amigo. Appreciate it. So this is it's a big responsibility to be the one closing the show here today. After all these brilliant minds. So today I will be talking about, not exactly about Cuba, which is my current book project. I'm working on a history of how Cuba became a slave trading nation. Instead of that, because I thought that maybe Cuba was too niche or too specific, I wanted to paint a big picture of the foundation of this system that we call this human trafficking system that we call the transatlantic slave trade. So we're going to start in the early 16th century. I might end in 1619 just because it's an important landmark, and I know because it's part of the conversation in this country, and it's important to situate this particular moment within the broader picture of the transatlantic slave trade from a hemispheric perspective. Since I want to keep this tied to 40 minutes, it's a lot. I want to cover 1 century and 3 continents. I'm going to read my presentation, and this is how it goes. In August 2018, the New York Times Magazine launched the 1619 Project, a compendium of articles and visuals curated by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones. The project commemorates the 400th anniversary of the arrival of 20 enslaved Africans in Virginia, a historical event depicted there as the beginning of the Black experience in the United States. The central goal of my talk today is to situate 1619's Jamestown within the historical context of the preceding century, an era when that massive system of human trafficking that we call the transatlantic slave trade was constituted and enlarged. Jamestown was a distressing note within a much longer symphony of sorrow that had been playing in the Atlantic world for over a century. Before 1619, nearly 500,000 Africans had been extracted from their homelands and scattered across the Americas from today's Argentina to Mexico. Before 1619, these people and their descendants had already forged communities, led uprisings, established maroon societies, achieved freedom, or succumbed to the yoke of captivity. While pinpointing a definitive starting date for the Black experience in the United States is not my primary objective today, a windfall derived from expanding our perspective and geographical scope reveals that 1619 is not actually the right landmark. Historian Jane Landers has extensively documented the first Africans who landed in Florida in the early 16th century. Others arrived with the Spaniards who founded the town of San Miguel de Guadalpe in today's Georgia in 1526. Some had settled in Spanish San Agustin in Florida since 1562, making it the oldest African-American populated town in the United States. Thus, by moving beyond Anglo-centric narratives and transcending national boundaries, we gain a better understanding of the true magnitude of what was a multi-continental system of human trafficking. First, a small disclosure. The transatlantic slave trade is a profoundly difficult subject to both narrate and research. In my years in archive, I have encountered disturbing images of human suffering that are hard to bear. In this presentation, for ethical reasons, I will intentionally avoid the most gore depiction of violence. Cuba, 1535. After years of naming birds and plants that already had names, cutting down ancient trees and towering palms to build houses and churches, and forcing the native to scavenge soils and rivers in search of gold until both gold and native had been depleted, the intruders started abandoning the island. In their wake, they left a trail of destruction. Of the nearly 2,000 Spaniards who had invaded Cuba in 1511, only 300 remained. The first large group sailed with Hernán Cortés toward Aztec Tenochtitlan, today Mexico City. Some tried fortune in the swampy lands of Florida, while many others left for Peru, chasing the wealth found among the Incas. The colonies left behind were the elderly, the infirm, or those bound by family obligations, political duties, and business interests. People unable or unwilling to partake in the promising exodus. Their letters, preserved today in the Spanish archives, convey a deep-seated sense of fear and hopelessness. 70 years old Guillermo de Huesos, a man with no wife, family, or anyone to look after him, was desperate. He lamented that, quote, the land was already lost and that everyone wanted to leave, that he would have followed the others if not for his old age. Political authorities were also fleeing. The mayor of Santi Spiritus expressed that he was determined to leave a place where everything was getting worse than today. That looks like Cuba today. Even the governor, who spent years chasing people sneaking onto ships, eventually left for Peru. The Spanish exodus provided the indigenous population with a fleeting opportunity to reclaim their land. Rebellions flared up, villages were torched, and many were slain. I'm afraid, Cuban bishop wrote, that the Indians will not leave any Christian alive. Yet, another danger cast its shadows on the colony. French pirates raided enfeebled Spanish villages. The worst attack happened in the summer of 1555, when the French Jacques de Sor plundered and flattened down. The villagers were picking up the pieces when another pirate showed up by the bay, only to find a woeful place with nothing left to pilfer. There were no doubts. Cuba's colonization was on the brink of failure. The colonizers knew they could not maintain control over this foreign land without reinforcement. They also knew that their fellow Iberians were unlikely to come to such a troubled place when better opportunities awaited in Mexico or Peru. Only by bringing people who couldn't choose their destination, people who had limited say in their actions, they reasoned, could their colony be safe? Could their own life be spared? Cuba needed slaves. Traigan negros, the colonists told Governor Rojas during his official visit across the colony. Juan de Espinosa, the notary of Trinidad, begged for enslaved Africans to be bought with funds provided by the crown. Juan Pedro Carmona, who complained about the solitude of the land, petitioned the same. They all agreed that, as the report reads, only in the arrival of Africans lies the salvation of this land.
And the British, when the British came in, the British drove them out of West Africa. This is how the Portuguese got to the Congo. The Portuguese were in the Congo for 100 years. But the Congolese were so organized, they would push them out of the Congo. The Congolese themselves would push them out of the Congo. Then they went to Angola. Mm-hmm. To both Spain and Portugal, you are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people. In other words, if a person is not a Christian, you are authorized to enslave the person.
To race, they were more susceptible to tuberculosis because of racism. TB especially preys on those who are marginalized not because of their choices or habits, but because they are marginalized. It's important to note that all this racialized medicine was challenged. It was obvious hogwash from the beginning, and there was loud rejection, especially from black healthcare workers. After a white doctor claimed the Negro is to blame for his own susceptibility to tuberculosis, a black physician wrote a response arguing that this kind of racialized medicine smacked more of the cheap politician seeking notoriety and office by playing to passion and prejudice than a doctor discussing philosophically a scientific subject for the diffusion of knowledge, which is the doctor version of an extraordinarily sick burn. And in fact, this bias against marginalized people and the healthcare workers serving them has proven to be one of the great facilitators of tuberculosis over the last century. Even after establishing that tuberculosis was an infectious disease caused by a bacterium, nobody was quite sure how this disease spread.
But before that, they killed off the American Indians, which is how come they needed black Africans for slaves.
When you talk about 1492, since this is...
From 1492 to 1590, roughly, the people in the Caribbean that you call Spanish, that you call Portuguese, they were 75 to 90% Jewish.
There cannot be any other congruent remedy an officer wrote to solve the decline of these lands than to import Africans. And one thing is to express a wish, and another is actually getting what you want. And they had to tap into machinery that had existed for over a century. It was not an extraordinary idea. Africans had lived in the Iberian Peninsula for centuries before Columbus. Although their presence could be dated to Roman times, enslaved sub-Saharan people started arriving in large numbers following the Islamic conquest of North Africa and Iberia. According to historian Ralph Austin, the trans-Saharan slave trade was responsible for the transportation of around 4.3 million people to Mediterranean ports before 1492. Additionally, from the 1440s onward, the Portuguese and other Mediterranean seafarers started nautical explorations along the west coast of Africa. By the start nautical explorations along the west coast of Africa.
Thank you very much, or perhaps, as I should say on the occasion, Toda al-Melotechem Hadivot, which is about all the Hebrew I know, so don't push me further on that question. So today I'm going to talk to you about Jews and New Christians in Portuguese Asia, which is an interest of mine stemming from not so much Jewish history as such, but actually from the history of the Portuguese Empire. So I come at it really from the other angle.
By the end of that century, they had already reached the continent's southernmost tip. On their return to Europe, they also brought enslaved individuals. On their return to Europe, they also brought enslaved individuals, with the largest estimate suggesting around 80,000 people before 1492. Unsurprisingly, people of African or African descent made up between 10 and 15% of the population in larger cities like Lisbon and Seville before the arrival of Columbus to the Americas. This is to say that the transatlantic slave trade that emerged in the 16th century was not an entirely new system. It was rather an extension of Atlantic routes that had existed for decades between Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. This connection explains why the first Africans who reached the Americas came not directly from Africa, but from the Iberian Peninsula, on vessels carrying conquistadores, tools, and merchandise, in conditions starkly different from the infamous slave ship that emerged a few decades later. The initial strategy of introducing a small number of enslaved Africans fell short in supporting the need for people for colonizing purposes. A much larger, sustained, and efficient human trafficking infrastructure was necessary. A key argument I propose today is that the transatlantic slave trade was, from its inception, an intricate web of interconnected components, akin to a complex machinery. It was a system that lacked a centralized force or structure, such as a dominant empire, government, community, or ruler. There was no mastermind behind it, no Wizard of Oz pulling the strings. To understand how this synchronized intercontinental network of gears interlock to set the system in motion, we will now examine the key components of this machinery. And for that, we will start in Europe. Following Portugal's maritime expedition to West Africa and the Spanish encounter with the Americas, the Pope divided the known world into two areas of influence. Spain had rights over the land located 370 leagues to the west Spain divided the known world into two areas of influence.
armies fatally under strength. Indeed, it's been argued it subsequently opened up the weakened empire to the advance of Islam.
And the materials that are the Portuguese Empire. So I come at it really from the other angle. And the materials that I'll be using are essentially then the materials of the Portuguese Empire, but sometimes somewhat on the fringes of it. So let me begin with this text, a very interesting text published in Amsterdam at the end of the 17th century, in the 1680s. It's a text in Portuguese called Notícias dos Judeus de Coxim, and it is written by someone who goes by the name here of Mosé Pereira de Paiva, who, as you can see, it says, printed this book. It's really a little pamphlet at his own cost. It turns out that this is actually a pseudonym, and it's more likely that this person was really someone, a jewel merchant, by the name of Pedro Pereira. So he actually changed his name slightly for the purposes of this publication. The text is, as I said, relatively short, and what it essentially tells us is how this gentleman, Mosé Pereira de Paiva, or Pedro Pereira, made a trip to the Indian Ocean in a context which he doesn't tell us very clearly about, but we know from other sources had to do with the jewel trade of his own family. In the course of this trip in the Indian Ocean, which took him to Gujarat and to the port of Surat, the great port of the Mughals in the period, he decided to visit southwestern India because he had heard that there was a substantial community of Jews over there. So this is actually an account of his visit to southwestern India and how, as you can see, relação do carinhoso acolhimento que experimentamos, which is an account of the warm welcome that he was given. And in the course of this warm welcome, he begins actually directly by mentioning a series of names that you can see over here. So you have the people whom he meets, David Castiel, Joseph Zakai, David Levy, and so on. And he gives us then, as the pages proceed, a sense of the composition of this community that he encounters. And it turns out that it is a very, very complex composition. So he actually gives you a sense of who the major families are. And of course, he also makes it clear that there are Jews who are present in this port of Cochin from very, very different time periods. Right? So there are some very old communities which he's aware of, and then there are more recent communities, some of whom date to the 16th century, some even to a few decades before his own arrival there. For example, one of the people whom he mentions is from the family of Rahabi, and it turns out that these are people who have come from Iraq a few decades before he actually paid a visit to the town. Now, at the time that Pereira came to Cochin, it was under Dutch control, or at least one part of the town was under Dutch control. The Dutch had built a fort there, or rather they had transformed an earlier fort that existed and improved it. And this fort was a fort which had been built by the Portuguese in the course of the 16th century in bits and pieces. The initial foundations of this fort go back to 1503, but it was subsequently improved in the course of the rivalry between the Dutch and the Portuguese. And what we see over here then is a situation in which this structure, which is presented here from the 1630s from a manuscript which I'll return to, in fact is the European settlement, what is normally known in the Portuguese of the time as Cochin de Baixo. That is to say, what is called normally Lower Cochin. But there is another part of the town which is not clearly shown over here at all, and which is not very clearly visible here either, because if you look at this sort of sea view of Cochin, you can see that mostly it's European-style buildings that are being depicted in the distance. But there is another very important part of this town which exists, which is normally called Cochin de Cima, which is to say Upper Cochin. And this second part of the town, and the fact that this town is actually divided into these two complementary parts, is really crucial to our story. right? Because it's the fact of this division and the fact also of an existence of a kind of situation of multiple sovereignty, which is going to be at the heart of the whole issue of the relationship between Jews and New Christians in this context, but also we'll see much more widely in Portuguese Asia. Now, Cochin, you can see over here in the southwest of India, which is going to be, of course, at the center of a number of remarks that I'll make, but I will also range much more widely and talk about a number of other centers, which you see depicted over here. Goa to the north of Cochin in southwestern India. You have Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. But we'll also talk briefly about Macau and even about Manila, which is technically not a part of the Portuguese Empire, but in some senses is linked to it because of this connection between the Spanish and Portuguese empires of the time. Now, if you want to go back to the earlier levels of the presence of the Jewish community in southwestern India, which Mose Pereira de Paiva is well aware of, he was certainly aware of the fact that there was a presence of Jews dating back to the first millennium, certainly. He was not very certain exactly how far it went back, whether it went back, let's say, 15 or 1600 years, or a shorter period than that. But there was something which he was actually not aware of, but we are aware of very well. And that is the fact that there was, in fact, a very strong set of commercial connections that were built between the Eastern Mediterranean and Western India in the course of the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. Right? And this is a connection that we know of and he did not know of, essentially because of the famous collection of papers of what are known as the Geniza of Cairo, of which you see an example over here, which are written sometimes in Hebrew and sometimes in what is called Judeo-Arabic, so using a mixture of Arabic and Hebrew. And these materials show us a very rich commercial linkage between a number of centers that you see running up from the southern tip of India all the way through to Gujarat, on the one hand, but on the other hand into the Red Sea, and then eventually into what would today be Syria and Lebanon, but also what would be Egypt and eventually North Africa. Right? And there are trading communities then which go back and forth, and we are able, essentially because of the work in particular of the scholar Shlomo Goitein and the recent publication posthumously of this massive book on the India trade that he had long been planning, we now can actually track a number of participants in this trade. And we also know what their centers were. Their centers included places like Kollam, but not Cochin, which at the time of this trade of the 12th and 13th centuries was not a significant center or a significant port. Now, when the Portuguese begin to interest themselves in this trade and decide to actually enter into the trade of the Indian Ocean, which is in the second half of the 15th century, they are not aware of a Jewish mercantile presence in the Indian Ocean. They don't actually have a very clear notion of it. We know that in the case of both Spain and Portugal, there was this very complicated and tense relation which has to do with this long process, which is often called the Reconquest. That is to say, we know that from the 8th century onwards, there was a moment when the various Muslim armies had entered Iberia, had created these states. You can see at a certain moment that these states went pretty far up north, what is colored here in yellow. But then from about the 12th century, a process begins by which the Christian states reconsolidate themselves, push back, and eventually wind up creating this set of kingdoms. So you have the Kingdom of Portugal, whose boundaries are defined relatively early by the middle of the 13th century. And then you have the Kingdom of Castile, the Kingdom of Aragon and of Navarre. And then you have, of course, this last holdout to the south, which is the Kingdom of Granada, which remains under Muslim rule until that fatal year of 1492. Right? And so we know that this is this very curious process, this very interesting, not exactly coincidence, which is to say 1492 is the year of the final expulsion of the last Sultan of Granada. It is the year of Columbus's voyage, and it is the year of the decision by the rulers of Castile and Aragon to definitively suppress a presence of Muslims and Jews in their kingdom. Right? So all these three things happen at the same time, and it is not a coincidence.
But at the same time, climate historians argued it subsequently opened up the weakened empire to the advance of Islam. But at the same time, the Middle East. By the same token, the massive mortality caused by the plague is generally agreed to have been around 30% of the population of the towns and cities affected, brought a halt to the expansion of the empire by leaving fields untilled, taxes unpaid, armies fatally under strength. Indeed, it's been argued it subsequently opened up the weakened empire to the advance of Islam. But at the same time, climate historians, using studies of ice cores, so you bore down into a glacier and you can see the different thickness of each year's deposit of ice. So thick years will give you a colder year, thick layers give you a colder year and thin layers a warmer one. Tree rings, the same sort of principle. Wide gap between the tree rings in a particular year means they've grown faster, so it was warmer. And other techniques. They've dated a sharp and serious deterioration in the climate to the years between 536 and 545, probably caused by volcanic eruptions in Southeast Asia, covering the globe with a film of dust in the upper atmosphere, causing poor harvests and bringing people into the towns, especially Byzantium, in search of food. Lower temperatures and wetter summers also favored the growth of the rat population in Africa, which expanded its territory till it got to the shores of Justinian's newly enlarged empire. Here's a graph of various estimates of climate change over a long period. And you can see a drop of the red line in the 530s and 540s before the climate recovers. And a similar graph of climate fluctuations taken from sedimentary deposits in the Sargasso Sea tells a similar story. You can see the dip as we move from left to right back in time, around 1500 years from the present. Well, there's little doubt that the plague of Justinian was bubonic plague. There's less certainty about the plagues and epidemics that swept across the empire in the following decades. But what is certain is that the disease more or less vanished from Europe and even the Middle East from the 8th century to the middle of the 14th. Perhaps it isn't a coincidence that this fell into the same time as the climate warming up to the extent that the Vikings across the empire in the following decades. But what is certain is that the disease more or less vanished from Europe and even the Middle East from the 8th century to the middle of the 14th.
Always on the lookout for the next big outbreak. But predicting the future is tricky, so to better understand how epidemics get started and how to counteract them, they often study examples from the past. Deadly diseases have been literally plaguing humanity for as long as we've existed, so there's a lot of material to work with, if you can piece together what happened. And sometimes they can, even for outbreaks that occurred hundreds or thousands of years ago. So today, we're going to talk about 6 of human history's most fascinating and terrifying ancient outbreaks. When the European colonists aboard the Mayflower arrived in what is now New England, they found an eerie landscape with recently abandoned villages and the bones of thousands of people. They later learned the ghost towns were from a disease called the Great Dying. See, Massachusetts and Rhode Island are the homelands of the Wampanoag Nation. Over 20,000 people were thought to be living there at the turn of the 17th century. But between 1616 and 1619, a mysterious disease devastated these coastal settlements. Reports from the time described symptoms like yellowed skin, fevers, intense nosebleeds, and skin lesions. lesions, and many of these cases were fatal. Estimates of the Wampanoag death toll ranged from 30% of the population to as high as 90% of it. And lots of diseases have been proposed to explain this outbreak, including smallpox, influenza, and yellow fever. But none of those seem to quite fit all of the reported symptoms, and that's led epidemiologists to an unconventional subject: leptospirosis. It's caused by spiral-shaped bacteria that live inside animals, especially rodents, and are spread around when the animals pee. A 2010 study noted that the symptoms of the Wampanoag epidemic are similar to some recent leptospirosis outbreaks in Japan and Europe. And the Wampanoag had some habits that might have made them susceptible to picking up the bacteria from contaminated soils or waters, like walking around barefoot and bathing, neither of which were very popular among the Europeans of the time. We can't say for sure that it's leptospirosis, though, because although there were plenty of remains in the early 1600s, no bodies from the outbreak have been found recently. The acidic soils of the region simply aren't very good for preserving the remains of humans or wildlife. They dissolve things too quickly. So even though it's a fairly recent outbreak historically speaking, scientists haven't been able to run DNA tests to pinpoint the pathogen. And leptospirosis isn't a perfect explanation. Some scientists have pointed out that these bacteria might not have been able to survive the winters in New England well enough to cause this kind of outbreak. Hopefully, further evidence will help epidemiologists suss out the truth, because there is some worry that leptospirosis and other tropical diseases may become more common as climate change brings warmer temperatures and more frequent flooding to northern regions. And if it was leptospirosis, this ancient case could provide valuable insights into how the disease spreads through northern ecosystems. For now, though, the Great Dying will remain a mystery. The 1500s were a rough time for indigenous Mexicans. Besides the arrival of European colonists and smallpox, the 16th century also saw at least 3 major epidemics of a devastating and mysterious disease known as cocoliztli, a word in the native Nahuatl language meaning pest. The very worst of those outbreaks began in 1545. In just 3 years, this disease killed as many as 15 million people, wiping out as much as 80% of the indigenous Mexican population. And the repeated outbreaks were devastating. Numbers plummeted from about 25 million people to just 1 million by the end of the century. Reports by a Spanish physician describe a grim set of symptoms, including fevers, intestinal distress, black tongues, and black urine. And victims usually died within 3 to 4 days. Once again, the identity of the disease has been the subject of debate. A 2002 study likened the symptoms to hemorrhagic fevers, like the disease caused by hantavirus. Because the most severe cases of cocoliztli occurred in the highlands and not on the coast when Spanish colonizers landed, the researchers suggested that the pathogen was probably native to Mexico and not introduced. But a 2018 study examined tooth pulp from 24 bodies from a Mexican cemetery dating to the first cocoliztli epidemic, and they found bacterial DNA belonging to the strain of salmonella that causes paratyphoid fever. Today, paratyphoid and typhoid fever cause more than 200,000 deaths per year around the globe, and a similar form of salmonella has been found in the DNA of earlier Europeans in Norway, so the authors suggested cocoliztli was caused by an introduced pathogen. But it's not an open and shut case. Some scientists have pointed out that the symptoms don't really fit a salmonella infection. Also, the method used to detect the bacteria wouldn't have spotted an RNA-based virus like hantavirus, and it can only detect pathogens we have DNA sequences for now, as it relies on a global database. So it could be that the team detected an unrelated salmonella outbreak, or that it was only a contributor to an epidemic driven by pathogens we haven't found yet. Further studies will be needed to sort all of this out. Pinpointing the pathogens in cases like this is especially important because the disease might not be a thing of the past, and the authors of that 2002 study make the horrifying point that the pathogen may not be extinct, but instead lying in wait until the right conditions come around again. In the year 541, during the rule of Roman Emperor Justinian I, something went terribly wrong in Constantinople, the capital city of his Byzantine Empire. Residents began to suffer horrible bouts of delusions, fevers, and swelling in their groins and armpits, often leading to death. By the next year, it's estimated that there were between 5,000 and 10,000 deaths per day in the capital. And this outbreak wasn't just an epidemic. It spread to multiple countries all around the Mediterranean Sea, making it a full-blown pandemic. It's been named the Justinian Plague, and it's estimated to have killed between 25 and 50 million people, making it one of the worst disease outbreaks in human history. And thanks to ancient DNA research, we actually have a good idea of which pathogen was to blame. It turns out that the Justinian Plague was just the plague. A 2013 study pulled DNA from 2 bodies in Germany dating research, we actually have a good idea of which pathogen was to blame. It turns out that the Justinian Plague was just The plague. A 2013 study pulled DNA from 2 bodies in Germany dating to the time of the Justinian plague, and found the genetic signature of the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the infamous Black Death. But it wasn't exactly the same as the plague which ravaged 14th century Europe. DNA studies comparing modern and ancient plagues have found that the Justinian plague and the Black Death were caused by 2 different strains, and yet another different strain caused a 3rd plague pandemic in the 19th and 20th centuries. This series of horrifying events has taught epidemiologists never to count out Yersinia pestis. Since the bacteria lives in fleas that hang out on rats, rodent populations can act as reservoirs, holding on to the plague until it's ready for another outbreak. As horrible as all that sounds, these ancient examples might reveal predictable patterns in plague cases, which is important because the bacteria are still around infecting people today. And scientists have noticed that all 3 major plague outbreaks are associated with times of unusually high rainfall, and that these strains of ancient plagues tend to share certain genetic mutations that might have something to do with how well they spread. So more studies of ancient plagues might give us the tools we need to predict the next big outbreak. Justinian I wasn't the first Roman emperor to see his dominion ruined by disease. A similar outbreak happened under the rule of Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. In the year 165, Roman soldiers returning from Mesopotamia brought back more than war stories. They probably also carried the pathogen that would cause the Great Pestilence, now known as the Antonine Plague. The symptoms of this disease, as described by the Greek physician Galen, included fever, bloody stool, blistering rashes, and skin pustules. And the pandemic spread to parts of Europe, Asia, and North Africa, ultimately causing the deaths of as many as 10 million people. As of yet, there are no DNA samples to help pinpoint any pathogens, so all epidemiologists have to go off of are Galen's descriptions, which aren't very detailed. Usually though, a nasty, deadly disease with a skin rash means one of 2 things: measles or smallpox. And scientists have actually ruled out measles because a 2010 study on its evolution found that it's a fairly new problem. They compared the measles virus to one of its closest relatives, the rinderpest virus, which infects cattle and their relatives. And their evolutionary models suggested that the 2 didn't split from their common ancestor until around the 11th or 12th century, too late to have caused the Antonine Plague. Of course, smallpox could still explain the rashes and pustules described, so it's the leading guess. It would be nice to know the disease behind this outbreak for sure though, since it had such a dramatic impact on the empire. The Roman army is estimated to have experienced a death rate as high as 15%, and some scholars argue that the pandemic was followed by a decline in business and trade across the empire. Some have even suggested that this period of crisis may have laid the foundations for the eventual fall of the Roman Empire. If smallpox was really behind this, then that's great news for us though, because smallpox is now extinct. It was wiped out by the worldwide smallpox eradication program of the 1960s and 70s. But if it wasn't smallpox, then we should really figure out what it was, in case it breaks out again someday. One of the oldest outbreaks we know of struck Athens, Greece in the summer of 430 BCE. According to reports of the time, the malady started in Africa, but its impact in Greece gave it its name, the Plague of Athens. Then we should really figure out what it was, in case it breaks out again someday. One of the oldest outbreaks we know of struck Athens, Greece in the summer of 430 BCE. According to reports of the time, the malady started in Africa, but its impact in Greece gave it its name, the Plague of Athens. The only account of this epidemic is found in the writings of the Greek historian Thucydides. By his description, the residents of Athens were overcome by fevers, redness in the eyes, bloody tongues and throats, ulcers, and more. Over just 5 years, as many as 100,000 people in the city died of this disease. That's around 25% of the population. Thucydides also describes another side effect of the outbreak: widespread fear, panic, and lawlessness. Like the other outbreaks, many diseases have been accused, but none confirmed. A 2006 study tested DNA in bodies from a mass burial in Lithuania dating to the year of the epidemic. They were looking for evidence of suspected bacterial agents, including the plague, typhus, tuberculosis, and anthrax. And they didn't find any of those, but they did find DNA which they identified as the strain of Salmonella that causes typhoid fever. But later reanalysis found that it was only a distant relative of the typhoid bacteria, and that it might have actually been a contaminant from the soil, not an infection. A study in 2015 suggested a virus was responsible instead. They argued that the symptoms are a much better match to Ebola, but testing for that is tricky. Ebola can't be identified with a DNA sample because it has none of its own, so we would need to look for the other important genetic molecule, RNA. But RNA breaks down much more quickly than DNA, making it much rarer in the archaeological record. Even at sites with great preservation conditions, it can be easy to miss. Still, with improving technology and a little bit of luck, we might be able to test for it in ancient remains from Athens. After all, it wasn't too long ago that researchers doubted we'd ever be able to find viral evidence from remains that were more than several hundred years old. But a 2018 study found hepatitis B viral DNA in human remains from almost 4,500 years ago. And researchers have pulled viral RNA from ice cores that date back thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years. The technology we use to study ancient DNA and RNA is only getting better as scientists strive to understand human evolution and disease. So deducing the real culprit of the plague of Athens may actually be possible someday. And if it was Ebola or a related virus, it could provide unique insights into their epidemics and maybe even help predict or prevent new outbreaks. Now, this last one is so mysterious, we're not even sure there was an epidemic at all. Thousands of years ago, when farming first spread across Europe and Asia, it led to increased populations and newly advanced civilizations. This included the establishment of mega settlements in places like Romania and Ukraine. These farming first spread mysterious, we're not even sure there was an epidemic at all. New outbreaks. Now, this last one is so mysterious, we're not even sure there was an epidemic at all. Thousands of years ago, when farming first spread across Europe and Asia, it led to increased populations and newly advanced civilizations. This included the establishment of mega settlements in places like Romania and Ukraine. These were cities that could hold more than 10,000 people, which was pretty impressive for the time. But starting around 4000 to 3000 BCE, they just disappeared. Mega settlements apparently stopped being built, and the old ones were abandoned. This time period is sometimes called the Neolithic decline, as populations across Europe seemed to nosedive, and exactly why this happened isn't clear. One common hypothesis is that the expanding populations grew too quickly, overexploited the resources in the environment, and then collapsed. It's also been suggested that conflicts broke out between different cultures, but others have wondered if a disease could be to blame, especially since it could also explain why the mega settlements were abandoned. And a 2018 study found the first DNA evidence in support of this idea. When the researchers analyzed DNA from two people found in a mass grave in Sweden dating to around 3000 BCE, they found deadly bacterial DNA in one of them, specifically the DNA of our old friend Yersinia pestis. This is the oldest known strain of the plague, and it suggests this deadly disease was active all the way back then. And those hugely populated settlements would have been great places for an epidemic to start and to spread. If this really was a plague outbreak, it would be the oldest one known, predating the Justinian plague by a good 3,500 years. But we'll need more evidence to demonstrate that there was an epidemic, or that an epidemic was involved in the sudden population drop all over, which mostly means finding more mass graves from the time period. If we can identify a disease, though, the plague or otherwise, then the Neolithic decline could be added to our growing list of epidemiological case studies. And the pathogen behind it would be especially interesting to examine, as it might be a nemesis that's been following us around for thousands of years. Or it might be one we've already defeated, and even that could teach us a lot about cycles of disease and why some pathogens stand the test of time while others don't. Delving into our history of deadly diseases may sound a little disturbing, but we should hope that historians and epidemiologists continue to explore these terrifying case studies. Because every epidemic is an opportunity to find the kinds of patterns that can help us determine the factors, whether they're genetic, environmental, or cultural, which allow major disease to strike over and over. And that, in turn, provides us with clues as to how we can get ahead of them. So by studying the outbreaks of the past, we can maybe learn to predict and mitigate the outbreaks of the future.
Now, what is suppress a presence of Muslims and Jews in their kingdom? Right? So all these three things happen at the same time, and it is not a coincidence. Now, what is often paid less attention to is the fact that with a delay of 4 years, the Portuguese then implement a similar but not exactly the same policy. Right? So this is in 1496 and 1497. And again, here there is an interesting coincidence, because then again, the decision to suppress the presence of Muslims and Jews in Portugal coincides with the first Portuguese voyage to India, which leaves the estuary of the Tagus in July of 1497. The Portuguese and the rulers of Castile and Aragon have a different policy in the following sense. The Portuguese are actually not that interested in expelling the Muslims and Jews. They are rather interested in keeping them there, but in converting them. As a French historian once put it, the difference is that the rulers of Castile want to expel the Jews from Castile, and the rulers of Portugal want to expel them from Judaism. Right? So they actually want to keep them, but to want to make sure that they're not in the same religion. Now, this is going to create a situation in which you have a set of people who come to be denominated, though it is a slightly older denomination, but it becomes a typical Portuguese denomination, which is to say, to call these people Cristãos Novos or New Christians, which could be applied to Jews and to Muslims converted to Christianity, but it is usually more applied, for whatever reason, to the Jews than to the Muslims in the case of Portugal. Now, these people are essentially the ones who I'm going to be talking about, which is to say the New Christians, many of whom remain under constant suspicion on the part of the Portuguese crown and its various disciplinary mechanisms, which include the Inquisition, which is brought into Portugal in the 1530s. And there is a constant suspicion, sometimes justified, but sometimes exaggerated. And there is a long debate amongst Portuguese historians, which we can return to if you wish at some point, about whether, in fact, many of these people were really crypto-Jews, as they were often thought to be, or whether, in some senses, it was the paranoia of the Portuguese state which portrayed them constantly as such, even when they were really not so. So this is an interesting debate, because a very famous Portuguese historian, Saraiva, once said that the Inquisition is the manufactory of the crypto-Jew. Right? That actually the Inquisition manufactures them, even when they don't really exist, because it's necessary to have this enemy within for certain purposes. Now, the Inquisition manufactures them, even when they don't of the crypto-Jew. Right? That actually the Inquisition manufactures them, even when they don't really exist, because it's necessary to have this enemy within for certain purposes. Now, when the first Portuguese voyage sets out in 1497 and eventually winds up in southwestern India, it doesn't go to Cochin. It goes to a port which is slightly to the north of Cochin, which is Calicut, which is a more important port at this point in time. The Portuguese voyage is partly improvised in the sense that they know their way around the Cape of Good Hope, but they don't really have a very good idea about navigating inside the Indian Ocean. So they're actually going to pick up informants as they go along.
Spain had rights over the land located 370 leagues to the west of Cape Verde, while the remaining east, including Africa, will be reserved for Portugal.
And they pick up a series of Muslim and other pilots on the east coast of Africa who help them across. But one of the people whom they pick up as an informant on the way back, actually in a set of little islands near Goa called the Anjadiv Islands, is a man who comes to spy on them, who's sent by one of the neighboring sultanates to spy on them. The Portuguese become suspicious of him, and they eventually catch hold of him, they torture him, and he confesses that he is in fact a Jew, a Jewish merchant, with a very complicated background, that he actually comes immediately, in his immediate past, from Alexandria, but his family seems to be actually from Poznan in Poland. And this man is seized by the Portuguese, and they immediately convert him. We don't know what his name was before conversion, but his name after conversion is Gaspar, which is the name of one of the three magi, right? So one of the three kings of the Orient. And he's also given the name da Gama because his godfather at the moment of conversion is Vasco da Gama. So he comes to be called Gaspar da Gama, but he's also sometimes familiarly known as Gaspar da India, Gaspar from India, which is, of course, a bit of nonsense in the sense that he was not from India. Now, this man, Gaspar, is a very important early informant of the Portuguese. So he's taken back to Portugal in 1499. He has an interview with the King of Portugal, and he gives them an enormous amount of essentially false information. So he gives them a portrayal of the geopolitics of the Indian Ocean, where he tells them that everywhere everybody is Christian, which is, of course, completely false. And he tells them that actually there are a few Muslims here or there. For example, you see in the case of Bengal, he says that the king is Christian, but the subjects are Muslims. But everywhere else, if you can see, it seems if you follow him, that in Ceylon everybody is Christian, in Sumatra everybody is Christian, in Thailand everybody is Christian. So this is somebody who is giving them false information based upon the idea that this is their expectation, and give them.
But in other words, if a person is not a Christian, you are authorized to enslave the person. But in the politics of the papetry, the Portuguese always got the best of the deal. They were better Catholic politicians.
Them what they want. Now, upon the idea that this is their expectation, and give them what they want. Now, Gaspar stays in Portuguese service for about 15 years, and eventually he gives them some rather better information. Eventually his son, called Baltazar, also enters Portuguese service. And as we move from this initial moment of Vasco da Gama, here imaginatively portrayed by a 19th century painter in front of the ruler of Calicut, as we move from this moment, this first encounter, to the 1510s and the 1520s, we get a presence of more and more intermediaries who are helping the Portuguese, and some of them we can clearly identify and give names to who are actually Jewish, or were Jewish and are converted by the Portuguese. Now, the Portuguese have a two-part attitude towards these people. Some of them they want to convert. And the problem with those whom they convert is we then lose traces of what the names and identities were before conversion. So we know, for example, of two of the most prominent informants of the Portuguese in the 1510s. One is called Francisco de Albuquerque, and he is very close to Afonso de Albuquerque, and he probably takes, again, his name from the person who's responsible for his baptism. And another man called Alexandre de Taide. And again, we don't know what these people's names were before conversion. But it seems that these people, unlike Gaspar, are typically Jews with an Iberian connection.
This resulted in an international division in human trafficking. Portugal would primarily supply captives, while Spain was the primary buyer for the New World colonies. To ensure a continuous supply of enslaved people, Spain established an administrative structure that, for the most part, existed until the late 18th century. The Crown would delegate to third parties the responsibilities of purchasing, transporting, and delivering enslaved individuals. This system of licenses, later known as asientos, became a critical source of revenue for the Crown and benefited a transnational group of affluent commercial companies and individuals. Although licenses were initially granted to bankers from different backgrounds, Genoese, Flemish, Germans, by the late 16th century, the Portuguese had fully taken over the slave trade. The Portuguese procured and transported captives to Spanish America until, in David Eltis's word, Northwestern Europeans intruded into the Iberian-dominated system.
And the Pope eventually, when the discovery was that Spain was grabbing more of the world than Portugal, there was a Treaty of Tordesillas, Pope had said, you take the East and you take the West, and you two good Catholic nations stop fighting among yourselves. And this was really as a result of Christopher Columbus grabbing. Christopher Columbus wasn't supposed to come to the New World. That was a violation of an agreement. But the Treaty of Tordesillas gave Portugal a big country called Brazil. Portugal, being so small, didn't have the money and the manpower to manage a country. And Portugal got lost in Brazil and dissipated so much energy in Brazil that colonial-wise, it couldn't move much further. Because, see, Portugal was already in West Africa. And the British, when the British came in, the British drove them out of West Africa. This is how the Portuguese got to the Congo. The British drove them out of West Africa. This is how the Portuguese got to the Congo. The Portuguese were in the Congo for 100 years. But the Congolese were so organized, they would push them out of the Congo. The Congolese themselves would push them out of the Congo. Then they went to Angola.
The Portuguese license or asiento holders were, however, not the ones directly involved in the on-the-ground operations. They were instead the visible heads of a trafficking web that cascaded down the trading hierarchy. The wealthy contract holders divided and sold the licenses to smaller merchants who financed, outfitted, and hired ship captains for the expedition. Captains and other ship officers, in turn, gathered the crew and oversaw the ship's loading. At this point, we are far away from the lavish Iberian palaces and castles. We are now in the realm of poor sailors, the world of taverns and cheap beer. The beating heart of the slave trade received of poor sailors, the world of taverns and cheap beer.
Perhaps it isn't a coincidence that this fell into the same time as the climate warmed up, warming up to the extent that the Vikings were able to settle Iceland in 974, and from there establish a viable agricultural colony on the shores of Greenland. Here are the Viking ruins at Kvalsey in southern Greenland. Correspondingly, bubonic plague reappeared when the climate began to deteriorate, as the so-called medieval warm period came to an end, I'll get back to that, in the second half of the 13th century, which brought the Viking settlements in Greenland into serious difficulties till they were abandoned early in the 15th century. In the years 1315 to 1322, wet and cold summers began to cause crop failures. In the 1340s, the climate deteriorated further, possibly because of cosmic debris circling the Earth following the breakup of a comet, hypothesis supported by contemporary references to strange sights in the night sky. However, these factors, even if you accept their importance, were only, you might say, enabling rather than directly causative. Climatic conditions, in other words, as they got cooler, became more favorable to rats, the spread of plague. But it took the expansion of trade, the growth of cities, and above all, the massive east-west movement of the Mongol hordes under Genghis Khan to really bring the plague back to Europe. This is a huge empire, across which not only silk and other Asian products could travel, but also rats and fleas.
Okay, so this is relatively new material that I'm addressing here, and I'm engaging with a complex set of issues that I want to clarify and bring down to a concrete level by at once expanding them and reframing them, drawing a theoretical model from a recently discovered state of matter called disordered hyperuniformity, taking the form of a cone-shaped material, and thinking about the ways in which they arrived at this theory from the vantage point of chicken eyes, appropriate for an Africanist, and the ways that you see it depends in large measure on where you're looking at it from. So imagine the cone from the top, from the sides, or from the base. Each is different. And we're going to be engaging with both Africa and Europe in the medieval and early modern period. To situate ourselves geographically, we're really taking a circle in large measure from Granada in Spain to Morocco, down through the middle of Africa, eastward to the Nile Valley, up the Nile and back through Turkey and back to Italy. In Africa itself, we're going to be spending a fair amount of time in the Niger-Benue river basin. So we've got here the kinds of materials that we're going to be looking at. And we're going to reconsider a number of objects, looking at them anew and what they reveal to us about our understanding of this period and how perhaps we can change in the ways that we've often considered this. The map on the left is a really stunning work that I had the great fortune of seeing in the library in Florence this past spring. It's a map, believe it or not, that dates to around 1351. The dates varied. It was actually edited over its life course between around 1321 and 1370. And as you know, this is much earlier than the Portuguese had arrived on the coast. And yet we have here a relatively correct, fully formed continent. It would have been seen upside down. I mean, the writing is facing the other direction. But it's quite remarkable for that reason alone. The Medici, the bankers, the financiers were deeply interested in Africa and trade and other characteristics of it. In addition to this, it looks as if there's also a means of indicating the Niger River and its flowing into the Atlantic in this area, possibly offering another means of access east into Asia. And again, we're thinking long before the travels of Columbus and others. And on the right is an ivory mask from Benin, showing alternating along the crown, alternating mudfish and Portuguese. It was dedicated to Queen Idia. And I'm going to look at the connections between Africa and Europe during this period, roughly defined as medieval and early modern. The key sort of hero of this engagement is Leo Africanus, but I'm also going to be talking about him as simply a brilliant scholar and his work on Africa, but also his relationship with Leo X, the Pope at the time, and thinking about how reconsidering Leo Africanus really provides us with new insights into the continent itself. A bit about his history, it's certainly well known. He was born in Granada, grew up in Morocco, traveled as a diplomat to Timbuktu, and later worked as a diplomat for the King of Fez and others in North Africa, and was actually taken captive aboard a Turkish ship returning from Constantinople, and taken captive, brought to Rome, met with the Pope, then converted, and became an important part of Leo X's engagement with the Muslim world and with Africa specifically. There's a fair amount on this history, some of which you probably are well aware of, this sort of larger history of Leo Africanus himself, his baptism, his relationship with Leo X, and the ways in which the history of the Mediterranean and issues of trade, and as we'll see, slavery as well, is a key piece of this larger story. He was a prolific author, fluent in multiple languages. Most of his works no longer exist. I've highlighted just a couple of things here which are especially important. Among other things, he was writing medical treatises. He was writing works on Christianity, translating some of the biblical sections, and his principal works that we know today are in part framed around his travels, his interest in Africa, and the ways in which Africa and the natural world co-join in a number of respects. The works about Leo Africanus are plenty, from Natalie Zeman Davis's work, which is kind of a fiction narrative, to the various translations of his travels to Africa. And that really is a story in its own right, because so many have been lost. I ended up, for purposes of this research, going back to the original French and Italian, because they are of different qualities. For the moment, at least till March of 2023, by far the best translation is in German. Rauschenberger's 1999 work with a number of images and a map. And he went back again to the early French and Italian sources, in part, along with others, for doing it. In March, a new volume is coming out by two British scholars who are specialists in the Renaissance era, particularly in literature, and I'm looking forward to it. At the same time, I think it's important to note, I think for the telling of the Leo Africanus story, having a sort of history or background in Africa, I think is an important piece of this. Europe has long been interested in the area to the south of the Sahara. And we can go back to the Romans and think about some of these travels, or we can come up into the medieval period where there were many, many travels, and move not only to the present day and the more immediate past, but also to Leo Africanus himself. This particular map is the one that is published in the German translation, and I think it's actually pretty accurate. It's taking us on his travel, first to Timbuktu with a relative. He was serving as a diplomat at the time, and then back and really across the continent from west, from Mauritania, to the east, through key parts of Nigeria and Chad, over to the Nile Valley, and then up the Nile River. I will say at the outset, there's some scholars who feel that because of his reflections in his various chapters and the way it was written, that he never actually arrived in Africa. That basically it's a kind of fiction of sorts. I disagree, and I'll explain why. Part of this has to do with editing. There have been, in his early volume, it went through heavy edits, in part to make it more popular, more readable, more understandable to a largely Italian audience who would not have known about, maybe would not have even cared about the details that were happening in sub-Saharan Africa. And it was also re-stylized in a way so that each is following a particular, for lack of a better word, geographic template as he's going from one place to the other. The other piece that is concerning to some is how he actually got back from, let's say, Nigeria or Chad to Egypt in the north. And part of the thing that I think Rauschenberger's gotten is that he went the east-west route, which is going to be a key focus of my work as well. This is a map based on Leo Africanus that was published early, and as you can see here, it's quite detailed. This, of course, is after the Portuguese have arrived in places like the Bight of Benin. But what's particularly interesting here is not only its detail, but also across the center of Africa, from Senegal really almost all the way to the Nile Valley, is a east-west riverine route. The Niger River in principle, although in early medieval manuscripts and others, it's often conflated with the Nile. We'll look at some of those shortly. But this was a well-watered route going really from Senegal all the way to the Nile Valley, filled with wadis, filled with river systems that were easily navigated. And I can't say easily, nothing's that easy, but one could navigate by boat or by foot, east-west. And in many respects, I would argue this east-west route was as important, if not more important, than the north-south route across the Sahara, and was equally important because it was largely controlled into the end of the 14th century at least by Christians rather than Muslims. And unfortunately, the Copts did very little to actually write about this part of Africa. So that part of the story is missing. But a key juncture in this route is the Niger-Benue confluence, the point at which in Nigeria, the Niger and the Benue meet right in the middle. We'll be going back to that shortly. And simply to add, this has long been a trade route, a route of explorers. You can see this in the map at the upper right. And still today is one of the main routes in which trafficking is done. Humans, ivory, arms, whatever. It is an incredibly important route, and it's important to understand this in terms of the history. I'm going to be spending a bit of time in one of the kingdoms that has intrigued scholars the most, that Leo Africanus is talking about, and that is the kingdom of Gauga. It appears in a deck of playing cards that are actually now at the Harvard Art Museum. There are others as well. It's a printed volume of playing cards. And what's interesting here is really for the first time that I have found the kingdom of Gauga is mentioned outside of Leo Africanus in the card dedicated to Nigratain, and there it's one of the kingdoms following after Timbuktu and Walata, which is in Mauritania, Bornu, and others. What's also interesting, this was a deck of cards that was created in Florence by a Florentine printmaker for the young Louis XIV, a 5-year-old child king. How do you teach a child geography, much less history? It makes good sense to create a set of playing cards. But this was clearly intended, was viewed. Notice who the Queen of Spades is. Barbary, in other words, the Amazigh, the Berbers of North Africa. And we're trying to, certainly of Leo Africanus, but also the other sources that were familiar to me, laying out so to speak, the placement of these various kingdoms from the broader medieval to early modern period. We can recognize relatively easily Bornu and Hausa. Hausa has grown really exponentially since the early years. And the kingdom of Gauga, based on descriptions in Leo Africanus and other ways, is situated directly south of Lake Chad. He identifies it as a Christian culture at the time, and in close proximity to some of the major river sources, the Niger and Lagoni rivers. Lagoni goes into Congo. And he mentions that here a trader from Damietta, so the coastal area of Egypt, had arrived bearing firearms and chainmail and horses, a mirror, comb, coral, and other goods in exchange for ivory, camels, currency, and people. But the positioning of Gauga is particularly interesting because it's considered by him and others to have been as wealthy as the Kingdom of Mali, to have been a major competitor in this trading network, probably linked to the Christian world in one way or another. Is situated directly south of Lake Chad. He identifies it as a Christian culture from the broader medieval to early modern period. We can recognize relatively easily Bornu and Hausa. Hausa has grown really exponentially since the early years. And the kingdom of Gauga, based on descriptions in Leo Africanus and other ways, is situated directly south of Lake Chad. He identifies it as a Christian culture at the time, and in close proximity to some of the major river sources, the Niger and Lagoni rivers. Lagoni goes into Congo. He mentions that here a trader from Damietta, so the coastal area of Egypt, had arrived bearing firearms and chainmail and horses, a mirror, comb, coral, and other goods in exchange for ivory, camels, currency, and people. But the positioning of Gauga is particularly interesting because it's considered by him and others to have been as wealthy as the Kingdom of Mali, to have been a major competitor in this trading network, probably linked to the Christian world in one way or another by way of the Nile. And with that in mind, we can read in Leo Africanus about this particular exchange here. It's pretty, in the structure, it's pretty similar to the other places, but each is specific in terms of what actually happened there. And people. But the positioning of Gauga is particularly interesting because it's considered by him and others to have been as wealthy as the Kingdom of Mali, to have been a major competitor in this trading network, probably linked to the Christian world in one way or another by way of the Nile. And with that in mind, we can read in Leo Africanus about this particular exchange here. It's pretty, in the structure, it's pretty similar to the other places, but each is specific in terms of what actually happened there. As I said, while he was visiting the king of Gauga, an individual from Cairo arrived and presented him with magnificent gifts, which he most bountifully gave. And he mentions the merchants from Egypt and how receptive he was to Muslims who arrived here, meaning that he himself was not Muslim. And specifically brings into play some of the gifts that had been brought. And I think particularly notable here, a well-trained and gallant horse, a Turkish sword, okay, we get that, firearms for striking. And if we look at the, up till now, only English published text from Leo Africanus, it's not chainmail, it's a royal robe. And there's no mention at all of firearms, it's simply sundry objects. So it's interesting in this light, think about this date, think about the importance of firearms and chainmail, and what this would have meant for Central Africa, trade, and the also the enslavement of people from here going north through another route. We have here as well something of what was being given by the Gauga king in return, including enslaved people, camels, and local currency, among other materials. So this tradition of objects, of chainmail and related protection continues into the 19th and 20th century, in some ways even into the 21st. The row in color on the right of chainmail and armor is now in the British Museum. And this has long been, it's been of interest to people who've understood and explored Hausa and Bornu and other traditions here. But the source of this has never really been known. And to some degree, we do not know, but it could come for whatever differences there are from Muslim or Christian sources by way of this east-west route. And simply to show how well the legacy of this has survived and the importance of looking at some of these issues with new eyes. I would also add that there was, in my mind, a rather underexplored and incredibly important article that appeared in the journal African History in 1967, which traces a Franciscan mission that went into the heart of Africa. The story begins really aboard a ship off of Tunis, a Franciscan ship, where there are a group of enslaved people. The bells call to service were rung, and they went to the bells and knew the liturgy, and frankly, the Franciscans were stunned. Here were a group from the middle of Africa who knew Christianity, were Christian, And what happened next, one of the issues is one could not enslave Christians, so it presented that as well as interest, that kind of dilemma. Enslave Christians, so it presented that as well as interest, that kind of dilemma. Enslave Christians, so it presented that as well as interest, that one could not enslave Christians, so it presented that as well as interest, that kind of dilemma. The Pope was informed of this and sent out a delegation to find this Christian mission, this Christian center in the middle of Nigeria or Chad, and unfortunately they never returned. So that's in a way the end of the story, but it's also the beginning of one. How would one look for a Christian center in Africa? What's the material evidence we might have for that? Was there more than one Prester John? I think yes. And therefore the question of the history of religion in the heart of Africa also perhaps needs to be reconsidered. So I'm going to take a bit of time and explore that here. Certainly we have bricks in the Lake Chad area that reflect a tradition that is strongly in play in the Nile Valley. We've got a remarkable site that we know today as the DGB sites at the border area between Cameroon and Nigeria in the Mandara Mountains. On the left, it's so high that you can see almost everywhere of any distance from it, and the orange area is actually view shed, what you can actually see from that site. It overlooks the principal route from Lake Chad to the Medowee River. Whoever controlled this site controlled all of trade, basically east and west along it. In the today, also the population who is very unusual in this part of the world. And we have other evidence. DNA, for example, suggesting that the population who lived here shared a DNA with a DNA that was far better known in places in Europe, Spain, Portugal, and Gerald. And we have other evidence. DNA, for example, suggesting that the population who lived here shared a DNA with a DNA that was far better known in places in Europe, Spain, Portugal, and elsewhere. And we have other evidence. DNA, for example, suggesting that the population who lived here shared a DNA with a DNA that was far better known in places in Europe, Spain, Portugal, and elsewhere.
The beating heart of the slave trade resided there. The realm of poor sailors, the world of taverns and cheap beer. The beating heart of the slave trade resided there.
There are people who are either Castilian or Portuguese-speaking Jews. Sometimes they speak both, and sometimes they also speak Italian. And so these are the people through whom the first governors of Portuguese India are going to actually execute a series of activities and missions. They will use these people to translate. They will use them actually even to translate diplomatic documents. They will use them in embassies and missions, not giving them usually the full responsibility of the embassy, but in a sort of a secondary position. So there will usually be a Portuguese who's a sort of principal ambassador, and then accompanied by, let's say, Francisco de Albuquerque or Alexandre de Ataide. This is the case of the first Portuguese embassies sent to Hormuz or to Iran, and so on. Now, in the rest of the talk, I'm actually going to focus on 4 of these characters who sort of navigate in and out of the Portuguese Empire. 2 of them belong to the 16th and 2 of them to the 17th century. And since time is a little on the short side, I will try to be brief but not too telegraphic. So let's think about these people as 2 pairs. So the first 2 are Garcia de Horta and Giacomo de Olivares, who are both in the middle of the 16th century. And the next 2 are actually quite closely linked for various reasons, which is Antonio Bocaro and Samuel Castiel. Now, Garcia da Horta and Giacomo de Olivares both come to Portuguese India at roughly the same period. Horta a little bit earlier. He comes to Portuguese India, so far as we know, in 1534. He's born in 1501, and he belongs to a family of doctors. So he is essentially someone who practices medicine, and he comes to be associated with a fairly significant nobleman of the time. A man called Martim Afonso de Souza, who those of you who know something about Brazilian history would be aware of. He's one of the earliest people who settles and has what is called a donatory captaincy in Brazil. And Martim Afonso de Souza comes to India in the 1530s as Capitão Mor do Mar, which is kind of a secondary title below the governor. He's the sort of head of the fleet, and he brings Garcia da Horta with him. Now, Garcia da Horta then spends the remaining years of his life in India. And it's very difficult to track what exactly he did and when. His main base was clearly Goa, but actually it turns out that he also had a small presence and a house and a garden in what eventually became the island of Bombay, which was actually ceded in part to the Portuguese in the course of the 1530s. And much of what we know about him actually comes from the fact that he published a book. Okay, which is a very unusual book from many respects. It's probably the third or the fourth book actually printed in Portuguese India. And it's interesting because it's the first book which does not have a religious content, which is published in Portuguese India. So if you actually look at the title page of this book, you can see, of course, that it has the viceregal permission. It says, como privilégio do conde viceroy. It's called Colóquios dos Simples e Drogas e Coisas Medicinais da Índia. So colloquia on the simples. So drugs and simples are often opposed to each other as products of India, and also with concerning certain fruits and so on and so forth. And it says that it was composed by Doutor, so he's using this title, Dr. Garcia da Horta, who is a physician of the king. And that it also gives you a sense of who has actually given the permission, because the Inquisitor, Aloysius Dias, as you can see, Inquisidor nestas partes, has actually given permission for the printing of this book. Right? The Inquisition, remember, was set up in Portugal in the 1530s and arrives in Goa in 1560.
And speaking with DNA specialists here at Harvard, this is apparently a relatively recent one. In other words, perhaps 3,000 years old, 4,000 year old, not going back to the origins of humankind in an earlier diaspora. So it's possible that reaching this part of Central West Africa, perhaps in the medieval period, we have evidence of individuals arriving in part to control trade. You wouldn't notice any of this, you wouldn't believe any of this by looking at the population here today. There's almost no extant parallels, but it's an interesting circumstance, and it's reinforced in part through language. The Hausa language shares key elements in common with Coptic language, and the crossing over of Hausa along this east-west route. The top map on the right simply references the site of the DGB sites just south of Lake Chad. The yellow dots reference wadis, or water-filled areas that for much of the year meant this area was green. And here we have it again, that map overlain with some of the trade routes, a medieval map at the top, a map based on Herodotus in the middle, meaning Greco-Roman, and at the bottom, this would be, I think it's a 18th century map showing control of this east-west passage by particular kingdoms. If there was nothing there by way of trade that needed to be controlled, there would be no reason to have these kingdoms there. The second site that's important to look at is the site of Banganardi, which is on the Nile, the southern Nile, an important Christian site, where, among other things, some traveler from the Pyrenees area named Bezansac decided to write his name in graffiti on a healing temple that was there. He simply wrote, Bezansac was here to visit Gabriel. Gabriel is the was the healing saint that was associated with this particular shrine. So graffiti is good. We can also learn other things from this particular site. One is that the same name is important in Spain, in the area of the Pyrenees. It's associated with some of the Templar strongholds in this area.
Good morning. So I want to tell you the rather strange and generally unknown tale, a story of how an American founding father influenced the modern revitalization of Jewish life in the 19th century, 6,000 miles away in Eastern Europe. Dr. Benjamin Franklin, as we know, 1706 to 1790, was a Renaissance man, was so successful in many different fields, including science, printing, diplomat. He was really a son of the Enlightenment. As we also probably know, famously, as a young man, he had not followed a straight moral path, which will be part of our story. He had a common law wife and he had an illegitimate son from another liaison. But what I want to mention at this point is that he was a well-known Freemason. From 1730 in Philadelphia, he was a Grand Master of the Philadelphia Lodge in 1734. And when he went to Paris in 1776, he joined the Neuf Sœurs, the Nine Sisters Lodge in Paris, where he famously sponsored the admittance of Voltaire to the group. When he sponsored the admittance of Voltaire to the group. When he returned to Philadelphia in 1785, he became the Grand Master of the St. John's Lodge in Philadelphia. So he was well known as a Freemason, and it was very much part of his decision to work with others of the fraternity for a moral improvement and for social action in the communities in which he resided. He wrote an autobiography, which he called his memoir, And he dedicated this memoir to his son, supposedly as a way to influence him in how to lead a better life than he had led as a young man. The memoir was written in 4 different stages, different times of his life, and was published actually in different parts. He first started writing it in 1760 when he was in his 60s, but then he put it aside and didn't continue it. It was actually in his house in Philadelphia when the British requisitioned his house in 1777, and the autobiography was thrown out of the house into the street. By chance, it was found by somebody who kept it and returned it to Franklin later on after the Revolution. Franklin wrote more in his autobiography until 1788, and then he died in 1790 at the age of 84. But the first part of the autobiography was actually published in French in 1791, and this is, in fact, the picture you see is from the 1791 publication. It predates the English version, so people were reading it in French before it was published in English. It was very popular. It's considered one of the best-known autobiographies written to date. And part 2 of the autobiography unusually has a special section dedicated to moral development and the personal growth of the character of Benjamin Franklin. He writes in his memoir, "It was about this time that I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. I wished to live without committing any faults at any time. I would conquer all that natural inclination, custom, or company might lead me into." As you can see, he's definitely moving away from his youth. "As I knew or thought I knew what was right and wrong, I did not see why I might not always do the one and avoid the other. But I soon found that I had undertaken a task of more difficulty than I had imagined. While my care was employed in guarding against one fault, I was often surprised by another. Habit took the advantage of inattention. Inclination was sometimes too strong for reason. I concluded at length that the mere speculative conviction that it was our interest to be completely virtuous was not sufficient to protect our slipping, and the contrary habits must be broken and good ones acquired and established before we can have any dependence on a steady, uniform rectitude of conduct. For this purpose, I therefore contrived the following method." So this was a method that he contrived in order to be able to develop his moral character. He comes up with 13 attributes or values that were important to him as he was seeking to become a more fully developed human being. He was very interested in the notion of 13 virtues or dispositions. He gives each one a name and then a brief description, not to avoid these men are all natural inclinations. Each of his work, temperance, because he believes that's the beginning of the way in which one should think about moral improvement, and then moves to silence. So each of these was in an order of his making that he felt one followed from the other. He particularly was interested in acquiring positive habits and overcoming undesirable ones. My intention being to acquire the habitude of all these virtues, I judged it would be well not to distract my attention by attempting the whole at once, but to fix it on one of them at a time. So, I ruled each column with a letter for the precise sharp. Did feel that this is explicitly Christian or religious, but he did feel that this scheme was not wholly without religion. As a deist and as someone who was sympathetic to all religions, he felt that there was a possibility of seeing this in a religious light. I had purposely, there was in it no mark of any distinguishing tenet of any particular sect, but I had purposely avoided that, for being fully persuaded of the utility and excellence of my method, it might be serviceable to people in all religions. Any would have likely in this method as well. He wrote near them, another but all Europe, we have about 2 million Jews who are living, of which 1.25 were living in this area here. In Jews, particularly by different parts in different countries. In this particular area, in this time period, throughout Europe, we have about 2 million Jews who are living, of which 1.25 were living in this area here. Heavily dense Jewish population in this part of Poland. Of 1 in every 2 inhabitants of a Polish city or town was Jewish, and there were many Jews who were living in the rural areas as well. It was an impoverished community. They were living in poverty, and they had been barred from many of the crafts and agricultural work that was permitted to other peasants in Poland. So they were therefore relegated to the trades that were really serving their own population, like tailoring, but they were also involved in alcohol distribution and tax collecting, which of course was not a very popular position. Their own population, like tailoring, but they were also involved in alcohol distribution and tax collecting, which of course was not a very popular position to have in Poland at the time. They were Yiddish speaking, that is the language of Eastern Europe, which is a form of German and Hebrew together. And they were pretty much unlearned in terms of any kind of Western education, although many of them did have a Hebrew and a Bible education. They had been completely untouched by the Enlightenment, by the 1800s. It was very much, Poland was still a feudal society with peasants and aristocrats. And of course, there was a lot of repression, persecution, pogroms, and of course, superstition that was held by the Christian church, and that was being spread amongst the population against the Jewish population. This is the environment in which I now want to talk about a book that was published in 1808. This book was published in Hebrew. It's called Cheshbon HaNefesh, or in English, Accounting of the Soul. It was published by a rabbi, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Satanov, Lefin. Here you'll see the name Cheshbon HaNefesh in Hebrew. Here you'll see his name Mendel, his first name, his father's name. Here in English, Menachem Mendel Lefin. Born 1749, died 1826. We have no picture of Menachem Mendel, Rabbi Lefin. He was a rabbinic scholar, but due to his intensive studies and the environment in which he was studying, he had a problem with his eyes, with his vision, and so he went to Berlin in 1780 for 4 years to receive eye treatment. In Berlin, he learned German and French and came into contact with a group of Jewish intellectuals under the leadership of Moses Mendelssohn, who had new ideas about Jewish community life in Europe. They wished to create the conditions for an end to Jewish isolation in Jewish life, as was very present in Poland. They spread new ideas about the Enlightenment to the Jewish community, including the importance of learning Western ideas, learning the languages of the countries in which Jews lived, and changing their dress and some of their religious behaviors in order to assimilate into European life. They also felt that working through trade, through economics, was very important for Jews to take on, and that this must be a part of the future of the amelioration of the Jewish condition in Eastern Europe. They hoped that all of that would be an impetus for European society, particularly Christian society, to accept Jews as full citizens with rights in each of their countries. This, of course, took a long time, was staggered over different countries, over different periods, but of course it started first in France under the French Revolution, with Napoleon granting full citizenship to all Jews in France and all of the countries associated with France at the time. So Rabbi Lefin, who had been in Berlin, learned about these new ideas. He went back to the Ukraine, to Poland and the Ukraine in 1784, and he worked to bring these ideas back to Eastern Europe. He was one of a few who was involved in this work, And in order to try and change the attitudes in Eastern Europe, he began to translate books of natural science and medicine into Hebrew so that the masses could read and understand them and start taking them on board. Now, in that part of the country, that part of the world that we looked at before, Eastern Europe, in Poland, the situation was so dire amongst the Jewish community that a charismatic religious movement had taken a foot and had become very strong in that part of the world. It was called Hasidism. You may know of it today. Hasidism emerged in the 1740s in that part of the world. At the same time, of course, as we think of the Great Awakening of new religious, charismatic religions across Europe and, of course, North America. So that had taken foot in this part of the world, and Rabbi Levin was very much against it. He felt that this Hasidism movement was asking people to look towards their spiritual and religious ecstasy as a means out of their poverty, rather than thinking of rationalism and modern European civilization as a means to get out of the situation they were in. So in many ways, Rabbi Levin was both fighting against the attitudes within the Jewish community that he was working for. That was both the Hasidic attitudes and also the attitudes that were keeping Jews in isolation, that was being exercised both by those non-Jews in those lands as well as the Jewish community themselves. He therefore wanted young people, Jewish young people, to understand what was right, what was wrong, what was the right path to work on, and how to develop oneself. So he created this book, Cheshbon HaNefesh, Accounting of the Soul, in order as a means to educate young Jews, a strategy that is a wonderful innovation in this field of Cheshbon HaNefesh, Accounting of the Soul. It would seem that the method will spread quickly, like the invention of the printing press, the amount of sin of which one is guilty. On the left-hand side, you see a chart from Benjamin Franklin, as we saw before. On the right-hand side, in Hebrew, you see the chart that Menachem Mendel published in his book, Cheshbon HaNefesh. We see here, on top, Shavua Aleph, the first day of the week, Menuchat HaNefesh, which is the virtue of tranquility, which is the one that Benjamin Franklin lists as number 12. Here you have a two-line description, which is the same in Hebrew, the same two lines that Benjamin Franklin wrote. Here you have Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, the letters of the alphabet, which represent the days of the week. So this is Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Down here you have the virtues, Menucha at the top. We'll look at these in English in a minute. Savlanut, Seder. So these are the different virtues, and there are 13 of them going down the list here. So as you can see already, this method was beginning to draw upon Benjamin Franklin's methodology and was now being used in Hebrew in a completely different part of the world for a completely different population. So here you'll see on the left Benjamin Franklin's virtues. Here you'll see the ones that are listed in Cheshbon HaNefesh by Rabbi Levin. You'll see that he's changed the order so that we start with Menuchat HaNefesh. This is number 11 in Benjamin Franklin's list. The reason why he's changed the order is that these are in alphabetical order according to the Hebrew letters. So this is kind of a Hebrew alphabetical list, whereas Benjamin Franklin's was a list that he thought personally one followed after the other. On the right-hand side, about 50 years later, in 1850, another rabbi, Rabbi Israel Salanter, took this list of Benjamin Levin, made his own list, which pretty much equates to Levin's list, and that became the reason why this became so famous in Jewish life. And Rabbi Salanter was the founder of a methodology called Musar. Musar is very well known today as a means of moral improvement and has a huge literature ascribed to it, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. So you can see here that of the 13 dispositions of Benjamin Franklin, Levin uses 11, but he changes 2. He takes out temperance and moderation. but he adds two others, patience and calmness. And so we're still working with 11 altogether. As you can see earlier, ascribe this method to Benjamin Franklin. He just said that a method has been devised. However, later on, one of his students, Samuel Jacob Bick, did describe this technique as invented by the sage Benjamin Franklin from the city of Philadelphia in North America. This scholar is renowned in all corners of the earth. Thus, Rabbi Mendel Leffin has prepared a delicacy for his nation and taught a simple and clear solution for the broken but still precious soul to speedily return from the bad to the good. In their approbation, the rabbis of the generation said that this thing is beneficial and new. So Rabbi Leffin himself was not prepared to admit that he had borrowed this work from Benjamin Franklin, and some of scientists do some research and investigation as to how this connection might have taken place. And I think it's connected to this woman. This woman, Isabella Czartoryska, is a Polish princess. She and her son traveled to Berlin in the 1780s, and she met the intelligentsia, particularly people like Moses Mendelssohn, who I mentioned before, and others, around the ideas of the Enlightenment, and particularly also the Jewish Enlightenment. She was a very powerful woman. She had a salon of her own intellectuals who met with her in her Polish palace. She brought together the kind of the finest and brightest minds of Poland, as Poland itself was trying to become more of a modern European state. And she was married, but in fact was a free woman in an open marriage. Her son, who was actually illegitimate, was born of the Russian ambassador and her liaison. So she was somewhat independent-minded, free-spirited woman of the time, and traveling across Europe also would have been something that wouldn't have been particularly something common in those times. Rabbi Leffin actually dedicated one of his other books to her on the occasion of her birthday in 1794. So we know that they knew each other. We imagine that they did meet, and that one of the reasons for him going back to Poland, having been in Berlin, was possibly in order to go back to work for her, because she became the tutor to her son. Sorry, he became the tutor to her son, and he worked in the Polish prince's household for that period afterwards. So she was married to Adam Czartoryski. He was very important in the new democratic Poland that was emerging, and he was also an enlightened figure, and he was a Freemason. Not only that, he was a member of the Neuf Sœurs, the lodge in Paris, of which Benjamin Franklin was also a member. He was very involved with the Polish Enlightenment, and he became the first minister of education, in fact, throughout the whole of Europe in Poland. He and his wife, as I said, employed Rabbi Leffin to tutor their son, and the connection between both the two of them and the Freemason movement prompts us to think about how this connection was made. It also prompts us to think about where did Benjamin Franklin get the 13 virtues from as well. We have mentioned the Freemasons a number of times, and it's true to say that, particularly in North America, the Freemasonry movement, which began around the 1730s, of which Benjamin Franklin was an early advocate, was influenced very heavily by Jewish immigrants who had come to North America, the first being Etienne Stephen Morin, who'd come from France. He settled in the West Indies and had come with a mandate to open lodges of Freemasonry in North America, and had brought with him his understanding both of Freemasonry but also of his Jewish background. We also have Moses Michael Hayes, who might be more well known here. He was from Massachusetts, was probably the most important Freemason in this area, and set up lodges both in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And also famously, Moses Seixas from Rhode Island, who was famously the individual who welcomed George Washington to the synagogue, the Torah synagogue in Rhode Island, and of which an exchange of letters then occurred between Washington and Rabbi Seixas, suggesting that there should be no bigotry or persecution of Jews in North America. So we asked the question, how did Benjamin Franklin come to know of these virtues, and in what way maybe did Freemasonry have an influence upon him in creating these lists of virtues? Now, we do know that there was a very strong relationship between one Freemason and Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin knew Solomon Bush. He was the highest ranking Jewish American in the American Revolutionary Army. And he was the Deputy Inspector General of Masonry for Pennsylvania. And very importantly, in 1781, involved in the lodge in which Benjamin Franklin was also involved. However, he died in destitute circumstances, and we know that Benjamin Franklin ordered that a pension be paid to him for his service during the Revolutionary War. So the final question that we may ask is, did the virtues that derive from the book of Proverbs, of which King Solomon is thought to be the traditional author, of which Freemasonry looks to King Solomon as their legendary founder, did the virtues influence the Freemasonry movements that brought their legendary founder? Masonry looks to King Solomon as their legendary founder. Did the virtues influence the Freemasonry movements that brought those ideas to Benjamin Franklin, who then created a method for moral improvement on a daily basis, which was then copied by Rabbi Leffin for the impoverished community of Eastern Europe, which then became a method used today in the Jewish community called Musar. Whether those connections are explicit or not, and whether they are apparent, there is certainly kind of an open secret, certainly in the Jewish community, that these things are part of our history